I want to welcome you first to our chemistry classroom for a while. I don't want to pretend that nothing has changed since the last time I saw you. That would obviously be a lie. And I think those changes have happened a little faster and maybe a little more dramatically than a lot of us were expecting. So I don't want to just blindly go into chemistry. Instead, I want to have a little conversation about where we're going and a little bit about where we've been. And a little bit about how we're going to go between those two things. This is still part of your Jesuit education, and what we do here still has the same thread that runs through everything we do. AMDG. Everything we do for the greater glory of God through our neighbor. So, the goal of today's conversation is to build a foundation of rock for us to proceed. A framework for us to converse through, even if we're not all together for a little while. I do know this is a time of questions, and to pretend that I have every answer would be a lie. But I still think we have enough here that we can work with, that together we can creatively, collaboratively, make a chemistry classroom in this way. Even if it's just some cards and my voice and my beat-up hands. I still think there's a real possibility and opportunity for learning here. There might be a good thing to talk about briefly why we're doing this at all. After all, COVID to a high school student is honestly not that scary. It's a sickness that for most of us would come and pass, and that would be about it. You've probably seen this picture. It's everywhere in social media at this point, and it's not a new idea. In public health and epidemiology, the idea of flattening a curve is a common way of explaining how to respond to new epidemics and new diseases. Unchecked, a disease will spread very quickly, and it will quickly overwhelm the carrying capacity of a society's health system, this black dashed line. Even if the same number of people get sick, but we can spread the time they get sick over a longer time, and then it means we are better with the supplies and doctors and information and facilities to deal with that. That we can lower the overall impacts even if the disease spreads just as far. And you're not at school right now, and a lot of things in our society are changing right now in service of trying to make this true. And it kind of can feel like a little overwhelming or a little bit distant from what you thought needs to happen, or an overreaction even. But I want you to look at what you're doing right now as a form of service, a form of collective understanding and action towards a goal. And I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm not someone who's working in public health. And yet I'm happy to talk about these things a little bit because I think they're important. But that's not the point of this video. The point of this video is to talk a little bit about who we are and where we're going. At Rockhurst, it would be remiss of me not to start with Ignatius. And Ignatius, as a young man, obviously had a moment where his life changed. He was young and hopeful and had a lot of ideas and was carrying those ideas straight into battle. And his life in that moment changed. And sure, the changes at this moment are a little different than Ignatius's cannonball. But they're still changes. And I think looking at how Ignatius responded to those changes might give us a moment to learn. After all, we do have a cannonball moment here, even if it's not quite the same, not quite as dramatic. A lot of the things that we were used to, a lot of the rhythm of our day has been changed. And a lot of things we'd like to do right now, we can't. It's not so different, actually, than Ignatius' convalescence, his time of healing. And I'm certain Ignatius wasn't an amazing person at this point in his life. I am certain he complained and bemoaned the fact that his career as a knight was probably over and his chances with the ladies not so good. But Ignatius in that moment didn't sit around only complaining. He also sat down and read because he got so bored. That was the only thing he could do. Now, I'm not suggesting we get so bored that the only thing we can do is chemistry. Though, if that's your only option, then great. But I really do want you to realize that in this moment of pause, Ignatius didn't stand still. He took the time to grow and develop and be open to growth, and what he did in that moment changed him fundamentally and is a reason why we're talking about him 450 years later. Now, I'm not suggesting COVID is the same thing as getting a cannonball to the leg. It's not. But the changes at this moment are something real, and something that none of us have gone through exactly the same way. Maybe this guy has something to teach us after all, right? And what we want you to do is, at the time you leave Rockhurst, is have you be a person who's committed to justice and open to growth and intellectually competent and loving and religious. And these things are different goals, or at least more complete goals than the average student. And somehow, with my little note cards and my hands here and my voice, apparently I'm trying to keep that goal moving forward. And so how do we do this? How do we take this person who are all of these things and make them true? Now, I've been around Jesuit education for a while at this point, and for me, those 5 things that were supposed to be at graduation all equate to one, which is to be vulnerable. And being vulnerable, moreover at a time of pandemic, moreover in the time of COVID-19, sounds really scary. And it is. Because being vulnerable, by its nature, means you can be hurt. But that's the point of having a heart of flesh. It also means you can love and show compassion. It also means you can show your humanness, your creatureness. And this idea of being vulnerable, of being open to newness, and embracing that newness with your whole self, is a response to suffering in the world that can't be taught through anything but experiencing in Peter Hans Kolvenbach, this Jesuit who follows after Rupe saying, "Be man for this." But Peter Hans Kolvenbach says, the gritty reality of the world. And for a moment, maybe, COVID is exposing you to a gritty reality. One that maybe you need to hear a little bit about. See, I've lived in parts of the world where this isn't new. Right? Where the idea of not being able to choose exactly what you do, or being unsure of where the next thing's going to happen, or what's going to happen to you and those people that you care about, that kind of thing exists for your brothers and sisters all around the world already. And it's not something I'm trying to idolize. That is the reality of poverty. That's the thing we're trying to change. Being committed to justice means giving people the freedom to do what they need for the things that they were created by God to do. But this reality that we're reaching into is something that, frankly, is new to you. At least many of you. And it's a good thing to recognize and let be a point of reflection. But this isn't the whole story of the world. The world is broken and hurting, yes, but also vibrant and beautiful and creative. And if we're going to be people who are Jesuits and Jesuit students, then our responses to these kinds of questions in our own community, let alone the world, must be the same. One of love and hope and creation, right? And so that's a little bit about what I want to do. And that kind of brings us to what you're doing right now. See, the world doesn't need you to solve COVID. That's not what you're here to do. Not yet, at least. And the world doesn't need you to sit still, because that's not what you're here to do either. You're here to learn how to be the person that you were created to be. That is someone who's in the image and likeness of God, full of dignity, full of hope, and full of ability. And just like I said at the first day of this class, and I've repeated throughout it, your job here is to learn to see through your own eyes again. And maybe here is a new way of seeing. But your job in this time, first and foremost, is to be a member of your family, a member of your community, and then to be a student. And my job, though, same, but to teach you. And this class is still important, even if the context around us has changed a little. It's still important for you to be able to use those skills to address the real problems in this world. And let me be clear, the solutions to COVID often involve learning to think like a scientist. The solutions to the problem of the world hurting and being incomplete and not full of dignity involve us learning to harness the powers of science and love in tandem. And that's what we're doing, and that's why we're here, and that's why we're not just sitting still while this goes on around us. Because this has already been going on around us when we started. The whole reason you're learning hasn't changed. Now, yes, I know this is not Rockhurst High School. And I know that this is fundamentally a different thing. And this place is sacred. And I understand that. It's a very important place to each of us. And eventually, we will be able to return to it. But for now, I'm asking you to make a little space for yourself, a little sacred space for you to set aside and do school. Just a moment to pause. I know it's not the same as being with your friends. I get it. It's not the same as being able to touch and see chemistry in a lab. I'm not going to pretend it is. But it's still a step in your own growth. It's still a step in your chemical journey. In your journey as a Rockhurst student. And this is what we're asking you to do in this time, not just to fill your time, but because we're trying to fill out those same promises and choices we've made all through the year. Right? Because ultimately you chose to be at Rockhurst and so did I. And together we're going to continue that choice. That's the whole point of this time. Understanding how we're going to make this work as a chemistry classroom is a little different. After all, we're going to need to fit together some new pieces that we haven't tried before. It's not going to work all the time on the first try. And for that, I'm going to ask your flexibility and understanding and collaboration. I'm going to ask for you to help me, right? My goal is to use this way of teaching consistently, every day, just like coming into the chemistry lab, to learn a little bit more about chemistry and to continue your growth as a student. And I think I have an answer to how a few of those puzzle pieces fit together, at least how I want us to try to start out. So this class is going to be based around Google Classroom and Edpuzzle. And I'm not sure you've used either of those before at Rockhurst. My guess is probably, but not certainly. So let me show you a little bit of how those work. Here in a second, a question is going to pop up. Do you notice how you had to answer that question to move on? Here's the really neat thing. That's going to show up to me in Google Classroom so I can grade it. It lets you participate in a lecture by saying, I understand this, or wait a minute, I'm not so sure this makes sense. And yeah, it's not quite the same as raising your hand, but at least I can listen to where you are a little bit and help you get where I think you need to go. And these two pieces are where I'm going to start off with. And if they don't work for us, then we'll try something else. If they do, wonderful. Hopefully they don't have to be the way we learn all the time. Look, ultimately here's how I see it. It's like you're walking on a path, and all of a sudden you've come to a stream crossing. And they're unfortunate. Your feet are going to get wet, and they're in the way of where you've been and where you're going. And I want to point out, just because you cross that stream doesn't change the fact that you started here and want to end up here. And yeah, you're going to have to think a little differently, and maybe work a little harder in this moment. And that's okay, right? That's okay. And yes, this is a place of difference. But ultimately, we will return to where we're supposed to be. And ultimately, this will remain just a small step in your journey towards being a Rockhurst graduate at graduation, towards being a person for and with others, right? Towards being someone who can use their eyes and their voice and their whole being to see the world as a person, as a scientist, as you. And again, I'm not sure exactly how each of these days are going to look. I can't be. What I'm asking you to do is to walk alongside, creatively, collaboratively, hopefully, and to share in this journey a little bit. Ultimately, I do know we'll get where we're going, because we've already been walking this way since you started at Rockhurst. Ultimately, I know that we have every skill we need to navigate these kind of changing times, and I'm hopeful to see you here in the classroom each day, even if it is this way. That's all I'm going to ask of you today. Be gentle to each other, take time for yourself, and I'll see you here again tomorrow. Buen camino.